You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans, as told to Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
This is Mayor Rahm Emanuel on Chicago Stories. We're joined by Ben Austen, author of High Risers, Cabrini-Green, and the Fate of American Public Housing. Ben, thanks for being here. Longtime Chicago resident.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. Are you a little shocked you're here?
No.
I don't think the emails. I think that the honest answer is you wanted to see if it was a prank call.
There's. I think that I know that your interest in writing about Chicago is really sincere and deep. I remember being here a couple years ago, and you had just read The Warmth of Other Suns and also the William Cronin book. And and I've done a lot of interviews with politicians where they say they've read things, and you were talking about specific passages in each. And so I know you like to delve into this stuff.
Well, let me ask you, you picked three characters. Actually, I got, that's true. You got Dolores Wilson, Ms. Annie Ricks, and J.R. Fleming.
Yes. And another guy named Kelvin Cannon.
Okay, so tell me, of all the people that come in and out of Cabrini-Green, why those four characters, and what do you think they tell the story of what you're trying to say?
I mean, so that's a multi-part question in a way from a writer, meaning, so part of it is like who gives you access, to recreate a scene in someone's life is hours and hours of interviews. And so someone that can do that, and also someone who's a good storyteller and has a good recollection and there's documentation. Also someone that tells the truth, that every time when they say something crazy and outlandish and then you discover that it's real and true, that's a good story. But when you talk to people and that you find out they're making things up, then you have to doubt everything. And then there's also that, so that's from the writing perspective. And then there's also this question of like, well, what story do they actually tell? And there is a kind of like, I don't think they're representative of all residents, but their stories do feel different enough and compelling in different ways, and they all strive to make a home in public housing and at Cabrini-Green, and they all fight to keep it, and they're all sort of tremendous people in their own right as well.
So my thing is, I mean, you're obviously a writer, and I'm on the political theater stage. Yeah,
you'll be a writer someday. You'll write your memoir.
But I think what's complicated is that the stories are always more complicated than people's stereotypes.
Yeah.
Either it's a total failure, or there's more humanity than you give credit for. I mean, look, Superintendent Eddie Johnson came out of Cabrini-Green. Yeah. His parents moved. Alderman Walter Burnett.
Yeah.
And
Kim Fox.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There are three people in public life in one way or another, two elected. But would you call, Ben, when you read this, do you think Cabrini-Green is a success? And I know it's not that easy because I just said you can't kind of stereotype it. You can't kind of put it in one box. Or is it a failure? Was public housing a success? The high-rise version of it that Chicago knew? Or was it really, in the end of the day, when you weigh all the equities, a failure? And what do you think?
Well, it certainly is a failure, and it's a failure of so many kinds. But you have to suddenly dig in what that means. And the counterintuitive thing is that there was also this rich fabric of life there, and a range of humanity that sort of that quick answer doesn't get at.
Right.
And then there are also, vast and infinite number of successes. And so from like a policy standpoint, when I think of you becoming mayor in 2011, and like when you look at, where we are in the plan for transformation and thinking about public housing, at that point, it's like, it's, high-rise public housing has failed. And like the question of should we keep the towers is almost the wrong question at that point. It's like, when do you go back in time and say, don't go down this path and make this mistake? And then what are the failures? The failures are some of, policy-wise. The failures are certainly individual. The failures are the media stigmatizing the place. The failures go back to the location, the aldermen making sure that they were in, black ghettos to start with. The failures are the federal government not funding it. the failures are the failures of America and like cities, and so that if you're in public housing, you get the worst of it when populations leave in the 50s, and when industry leaves. Those are the places that feel it the worst.
So they're on the front line of that.
They're on the front line. The old saying about, when America gets sick, or catches a cold, poor neighborhoods get the pneumonia.
I always feel like when you look at this, Cabrini-Green and Robert Taylor, just to name two of the housing projects, became a metaphor for, basically, I don't mean to put a point on a map, an inflection point, Reagan forward, of what was wrong with urban policy or the misguidedness of both the Great Society, the New Deal, etc. And then, I don't want to say it had but I will say it's self-fulfilling prophecy that each problem became it became the character of that public housing. And then the equities of keeping it, I think, were too much versus almost trying to start anew and hit the reset button. I don't know what do you think of the plan of transformation? What do you think of
so first, partly why
do you think that's right, the inflection point?
There's no doubt that they became stand-ins for an idea, a certain sense of failure. Cabrini-Green, one of the reasons I was interested in it is because it filled up so much space in the city's psyche, like in this mythical space. And so to investigate that, and became an idea about inner cities. You're exactly right. So what if I threw that back at you? So you're on the board of the CHA at a moment when these...
is this a Talmudic part where you ask me the question? Go ahead.
So, what do you, there is some point where, you're like, do I think the plan for transformation is a good thing? That's a super loaded question. I think there was a moment in time when we thought that the great evil was concentrated poverty, and like whatever it took, the means would justify the ends to get rid of that. And I think, in my opinion, Mr. Mayor, that we still have concentrated poverty and isolation. Yeah. They're just not in these giant visible towers.
So here's the concept. Let's rewind the tape, right? You had high rises that were concentrations of poverty that both separate garbage service, literally not only physically, culturally, service-wise, economically, cut off from the mainstream of the city. And the concept was, we can't fit, it's so broken that you almost have to start again. Now, I think the concept of getting people of mixed backgrounds in the same housing was the idea that you were going to put people of poverty and from former public housing in with a mainstream, and it would have its own benefit. I actually still think that's right, but there wasn't the follow-through of support to help them. You can't go from hot to cold or from cold to hot. And I think there is in former food deserts, you now have a Target right where Cabrini-Green is. You have I think 2,500 units up that have mixed income, more to come. And so the question was I don't think it was wrong. It had its own challenges. On the other hand, was everything going forward done right so you didn't repeat some other set of mistakes? And that's an open question without the answer yet.
So for a neighborhood like the near North Side, there's no doubt that the neighborhood benefited. Meaning like
I got what you mean.
A community that had 15,000 to 20,000 extremely low-income families, you remove them, it turns out it's a better neighborhood, meaning like it's thriving. You include more tax base, all the other things, stores. I feel like the showcasing of mixed income is a little bit of a red herring, meaning I agree with you, of course, it's just better housing. But it's, in terms of supply, it's not the solution to low-income housing. It's just, by its very design, smaller and just a slight mix, 30% of whatever. So that is not, it's not either public housing or mixed income, because mixed income, we're talking about, suddenly a few hundred rather than a few thousand, and there's still this need. And so...
So let me ask you, you're a writer, which is not the same as a journalist, and you're also a journalist. Well, let me say this. You're a journalist who decided to write a book. How do you start this book about Chicago and about the high-rising, but also talking about public housing in America and what happened, the abandonment or somewhat turning its back on it? And I will come back to one comment I want to say about the plan for transformation, which is, how do you start and still have a fresh slate where you don't come in preconceived and kind of filter out what doesn't work with your version? I mean, obviously you didn't just like wake up one morning, you know what? We should do something on public housing, and you didn't have any earthly idea. You had a preconceived.
Yeah.
So how is a journalist / writer, whichever one you want to pick, still be open to information that doesn't work with what you think is the story? I'm always fascinated from obviously my perspective.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
I mean, I truly believe I have an open mind in the sense of if I'm interviewing, like I do for this, hundreds of people, their stories are the ones that I'm wrestling with. And, you know, whether it's a politician or a resident or a developer or a store owner or a police officer, I have to suddenly make sense of that. And how does it fit together? Stories sometimes conflict, you know, what the information people you give, and I'm also thinking about history and policy and looking into that. But the truth is like also, so I'm a South Sider, and so
you went to Kenwood, if I remember.
I went to Kenwood,
right?
And thinking about the North Side, like, you know, for us on the South Side, that housing development loomed mythical as well. And then also thinking about, you know, you said about other cities, like I think it's also not just a Chicago story. It's like the story of American cities. You know, suddenly you're in this bigger sweep of history as well, which is like, you know, starting with European immigration here and then an industrial neighborhood like that, and how, you know, dirty and dangerous it is and who lives there and how it's a white slum, and then black migration, and suddenly it's a black neighborhood, and suddenly it's a place to put public housing. Those are stories that were in every city, every industrial city in America.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, you know, Chicago, we're talking about building a museum.
Yeah, I spoke there this week at the National Public Housing Museum.
So you know, here is something, Ben, and I know you're doing public housing. One of the things I'm trying to do, I think housing is housing. The goal of a mayor or a city is to build a neighborhood. And housing without a library, housing without, you know, school or public transportation is housing. All those other pieces, you're building a neighborhood and community that can kind of have some cohesion and hold together. And that's what I think where the plan for transformation is partially on the right track, not fulfilling what it can be.
Yeah, so I completely agree that affordable housing is affordable housing. But there is a kind of pressure on, say, you, when we literally own the problem. You know what I mean? Like, we literally own that land. And so, problems with affordable housing, say, in Englewood now, which has sort of emerged as like our Cabrini-Green at this moment, you know, we have to wrestle with it. But if it's not, you don't actually own the deed, which you used to, whether, you know, that's a different issue.
Right.
And it's a different pressure on you. Like, people are protesting outside City Hall or you know, calling on the head of the CHA.
Or your home.
Yeah, or your home, right, like last week. So I think that's a difference. And I agree, you know, when I think of public housing, I also think what it means in terms of just this basic democratic idea that we invest in, you know, housing at some, you know, rudimentary level for everyone.
I'm slightly... So, give you an example. In Woodlawn, which I would use as a different neighborhood, you have housing. We've worked with HUD during the Obama years. You have a new train station. You have the sport facility, the RAC, with also has nutrition and tutoring, academic, but it has sports. You have more retail. We have the first new grocery store in the food desert. You have a school by the University of Chicago coming in, public school. And to me, that's building a community, where in the past, we would do housing. I mean, when I say past, I'm talking about in the 60s, and that was it. It wasn't with all the other pillars that build a neighborhood and community. And that to me is kind of, I don't know what you think of it, but that to me is the model you want to go to, because I think housing in and of itself, without anything else, is stripped down to just one essential. When, if you're dealing with poverty and all the other things, you have to have even more resources to kind of boost up and give support. Yeah.
I mean, certainly. I mean, but I don't think that's an either or of, like, you know, community development, building neighborhoods, or thinking about meeting this demand for housing. And I mean, I think you're right that a problem with large public housing developments, if you think about a community of 20,000 people, and it's as large as most townships here, and like it has nowhere near the resources like swimming pools, gyms, schools, stores, everything you need to make a town. And suddenly it's, it's only on 70 acres, but it's the size of Evanston or something, population-wise. And so, it's hard to rely on the federal government to deliver all that, or the city. One thing I struggle with, and even sort of advocating for many of these issues, is like the public sector itself has failed in a lot of ways. Like when we badmouth, say, public housing, we're also saying that the CHA and HUD and the federal government and city government did a bad job. But we also want more of it. If you have a political bent like me, I'm saying, no, I still want more. I want you to do it more but better. And so we become kind of an easy target for people on the right because we really did, we didn't do it well. I don't know.
No,
I'm curious what you think because
Well, here's what you can't have progressive politics if people have a negative view of government and they think that you can't run a one-car parade. If the public thinks that government cannot run a one-car parade, there's no basis or foundation for progressive politics. And the first thing, which I attribute to President Clinton, is we have to give people confidence that government is an affirmative force. Doesn't mean it has to be everything. Now, one of the things I would say as a practitioner of government and politics, we're used to either first or fifth gear, and there's a lot more between. And I would say that you don't want to, Reagan played that government was the problem, and anything government touched, it messed up. And I would argue that's not true. In the 60s, 1 out of 3 people poor were seniors. Today, they're 1 out of 10. Welcome to the success of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. It's actually succeeded way beyond anything the country's ever tried. That said, there are things that I think your key word is not whether government does it or doesn't do it, is whether it does it well or fails at doing it. And there's not a defense of the plan of transformation because there's other aspects of government, whether it's public education or otherwise, that you have to give people confidence that we can effectively do something and do it well. And there are different ways to get to what well is, not just one. Now, why do you think Chicago? So I don't know if that's the answer to the question you're.
No, I think that's. I think we're saying we're both agreeing in this kind of generalized way. Yes. I also think when I think about like the arc of public housing in America, it's also an arc of our collective sense in this social safety net, meaning like the aversion towards that becomes way more mainstream. Meaning like by the time you get into you're in Washington, that you have Democrats who are like, welfare, let's cut this back, or like let's scale back HUD and let's rethink it.
Here's my view: is that government is involved in every layer of housing. The problem with describing this as public housing, I'm sorry, the mortgage deduction is a housing policy. It's completely. A public, and that is not called public housing. It is.
I do it. I call it that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here's the question: is where Roosevelt was when he decides America as a government is going to be involved in building and managing housing for the poor people, or affordable. We'll call it affordable housing. Did we go wrong? Did it ever leave that kind of basic concept? And if it did and deviated from that mission, where did it go wrong and why? Did it leave what was not just lofty, a right aspiration? I think it was 36. What was the year?
37 is the act, yeah.
So 37 is the act, so he introduced it in 36. So is public housing today the same that Roosevelt hoped? That's kind of a trick question. And B, if you think is it still on that course, or do you think it's faltered from that mission? And what and why? And at what point do you think that happened?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, there was pushback then as now, right? Like there were large groups that didn't think this was a good idea, including the private sector, who was like, "This is taking away from money we could make," and it wasn't. It was mostly in big cities. The sense of like public housing going wrong, like the things that get blamed on public housing. I said this before, but like if you think of building first these low rises in cities. I mean, something like the Cabrini row houses, which is built right after World War II. And it's a mixed race, mostly working class neighborhood, and the public housing, the row houses are mixed race and working class. But, so you have racist housing policies that also make public housing necessary. So we're wrestling with that, meaning that there isn't an open market for African Americans to get housing. But then just the cities themselves start to suffer to such an extent that it's for that burden to also be put on public housing.
It's an unfair judgment.
It's an unfair judgment.
Yes, I agree with that.
But public housing also, has its own problems. I mean, so then in Chicago, by placing them only in existing black neighborhoods, we sort of solidify racial boundaries. We're already like the most segregated city, and we make it even more so. And then, so it's already like starting, from way behind. Yeah, and then you also have the design elements, which sometimes get blamed too much, but they are problematic. Like you should have a greater array of housing types rather than this tower in the park design.
Why do you think Chicago, in all your work then? So you must have gone to other cities, et cetera. And it's interesting. Do you ever read the book Evicted?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very excellent book.
Fantastic.
Why do you think Chicago, not just, you're focusing on Cabrini-Green as the metaphor for Chicago.
And for cities,
And why do you think Chicago, when it comes to public housing, became the metaphor? Or maybe it didn't. I think it
did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why do you think that is?
Well, so it's not New York because they actually sort of managed their public housing pretty well until recently. They're like, I mean, I'm seeing them. They look like Chicago in the 90s. I feel like they're about to fall off the cliff in a way. But yeah, you also think of, you talk about Chicago as the great American city. I've heard you say this before. The most American of American cities. And so, in this sense of like neighborhoods and racial tension and huge numbers of people, but not a coastal place. It feels like these elements were more so here. And it's on people's minds. I don't know. So just the way that a place like Cabrini-Green becomes a national, both sort of slur and punchline.
Do you think it would have happened if Jane Byrne didn't move in it? Do you think Cabrini-Green would still be that kind of punch way above its size, so to say, from a symbolic statement?
I mean, that's certainly sort of elevated it, but I think she also moves in there for that reason. Like she understood inherently that it filled that space. I think its location had a lot to do with it. She, not just her living 10 blocks away, but that the media able to go there to get its stories rather than go to the South Side. The first thing that sort of elevates it into this larger idea is in 1970 when 2 police officers were shot there, and then Byrne doing it. Then it becomes this national idea. There's this Saturday Night Live skit, which I write about in there, where a teenage single mother who is named Cabrini-Green Harlem Watts Jackson. And you think about...
I don't think I remember.
And so you think about that kind of, pantheon of scary urban places, and that it's entered that space. This is in the 80s.
Now, it's interesting because not this weekend, but next weekend, we're opening up XS Tennis's facility on the old Robert Taylor site. It's going to be I think 5,000 kids will come in and out of there playing tennis on a daily basis, getting not only athletic but academic and all types of other kind of holistic approach. It's the first of our student sports centers that we're opening up across the city. I happen to think that's a good transformation of that land into something that I think can be a big affirmative thing. And we're doing it as a partnership. I mean, Kamal's running it. It's his vision. We're investing in his vision as a thing. I mean, that to me, there's more stories to the change than one thing, whether mixed income housing is working or not working. I don't know if you agree.
No, so I mean, I grew up playing tennis in that very neighborhood, meaning Kamau and I had the same coach as kids and grew up playing at the same club on 47th Street. Like we have similar paths in that way. And I've already been over there.
Was he a better tennis player?
He's also younger, so he certainly is now.
A little more limber. His backhand was better.
So he, I also agree like that every bit of CHA land doesn't have to suddenly be dedicated to housing. And so thinking about these other alternatives is wise. And the CHA is certainly more nimble than it was before and able to do more things. And thinking that, this question you had before, that it's not just public housing, there still is just this incredible need.
Yes.
And so...
Mariano's in Brownsville's at a former housing.
So to celebrate that Mariano's, that it's not a food desert,
Right.
and similar land, or that the CHA working with a library to sort of place something in neighborhoods where there never was any public housing, but to sort of look at those dots and connect it and think that it shows a finished picture, I think that's not right. That those are all pluses. But somehow we're still having such destabilization in these same neighborhoods. You brought up Woodlawn, and I would also say you drive through Woodlawn and their blocks were
yes.
and their house missing, and there's just violence that doesn't make sense, and there's school closings, and so this is like I write about housing, and you have to think about all of these issues, and that to me, when I talked about these issues being less visible, that's what I worry about.
So you're sitting with the mayor.
Yeah.
I think one of the big, besides, there's a series of things. I just came from an announcement where we won a recognition at our schools for the best advanced placement in the United States. Gave us an award, and more kids in Chicago are taking it all. And when more kids take it, your test scores are supposed to go down. Ours keep going up, and kids of all backgrounds and ethnicity. So on housing, though, specifically, and as we both say, there's a lot of threads coming through that are not just housing.
Yeah.
4 takeaways the mayor must have from Ben Austen as you deal with getting and ensuring neighborhood stability and affordable housing in that area that you think that are important.
So I think that because, I don't know if I'll be able to enumerate them. So
That's okay.
I think because that
I'm not putting you on the commission then.
No, I'm not going to make your commission. I think that because we're not like Detroit or even Philadelphia, that we're thriving in so many areas. And I'm not going to harp on this, tale of two cities, trope, because I think, you don't need to talk about that. But I think because we are thriving, it's easy for a lot of Chicagoans not to focus on the parts where we're suffering.
Yeah.
And so even that we can talk about schools that are doing well at the same time that we're facing another round of school closures. And I think, or just the weekly tally of gun violence, which, erodes at community, a sense of community and safety.
Soul.
And I think about the population, the African American population that has decreased by 250,000, since about 2000, since the start of the plan for transformation. And that, I guess, I sitting here with the mayor, I want to hear from you.
I asked you
these declarations, but this is like you said. Well, I want to hear here are the reasons to stay.
No.
Don't leave. I want to hear hope. I want to hear.
Well, first of all, you have. I do think. Look, the primary thing, if you go through it, is education.
Yeah.
That's Ben. You wouldn't be sitting here, and I wouldn't be sitting here. I can't say I've read a little about your family. Well, there's similars. You and I share two things. We both had very involved, loving parents and who emphasized education.
Yeah.
The one thing I know is that education is the most important thing. I can't do anything about a parent, yes or not, loving their child appropriately, okay? I do know that Chicago is not what William Bennett described 30 years ago and is now receiving 30. Yeah. You bring up school consolidations. My view is I think having kids trapped in failure is irresponsible of a mayor who can spend political capital. Would I be more popular if I left schools alone? Would those kids' futures be right if I let them get trapped? Now the fact is, our math scores are up, our reading scores are up, our graduation up, and we're beating the rest of the country. So to me, it is the thing why your parents moved from one part of the city to another, or my parents moved from one part of the city to the suburbs, and I moved back, is because in the end of the day, as parents, you have a responsibility to your children's education. And the fact is, Chicago schools are working, and now, as the Washington Post noted, and the New York Times noted, as Professor Reardon at Stanford noted, the University of Chicago noted, and the University of Illinois Chicago, UIC noted, all three independent studies, we are leading the country. And so that, to me, since people make, as parents, decisions about their kids, the schools are right. We have a challenge as it relates to public safety. And we're meeting, no, hold on, I'm going to finish the whole thing. You asked me, because, well, I think the schools are.
No, I agree.
And in fact, that I think actually, if I would offer you, is I actually think you have a responsibility as a journalist to actually take off the blinders. And as this gentleman at the AP said, you should look at success and not run away from it.
You need to look at the story I did last year where I interviewed 20 valedictorians and salutatorians.
Right, so here's my thing, is my biggest sense of the urgency of now is that the kids that are in school are going to be, I'm not going to guarantee 100%, they're going to be okay because it's actually on the right track finally. And it's not just my work, it's a lot of people over a long time. Second is we have the highest employment in the history of the city, some people mark it since 1950. My sense of the urgency of now is we have young men, principally, not limited to, but young men, on the street corner who are not in school, never really finish, not in the work environment. And if we don't seize this moment to get them at least in work or at a place of, community college, GED or something, we'll have missed a historic window. And I feel that the urgency for us is to actually address those who are both out of work and out of school and miss the boat. Because one piece, at least for the kids that are in elementary and high school, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we're doing better than we've ever done as a system. The biggest thing to make sure that we don't empty out is to grab those who are literally on the street corner now and get them into the economic mainstream of what is succeeding today.
So I will go back to what I said about that we're doing well in places, and that if you take schools, for instance, and the success which you're talking about, which is deserves incredible praise, and there's so many amazing students in these schools and teachers. Yeah. But it's not like where we're closing schools or thinking about it, that there are 4 options around those schools that are wonderful. The wonderful options are far away. And so those neighborhoods are not choosing between.
Yes and no, and that's I'll take you on a tour. So here's the deal: you'll take me on a tour of where you think, I'll take you on a tour. To me, is that Chicago actually is in certain places making tremendous strides in leading. Other places we're leading, and we should actually not want to lead in that area. Violence being one. Now, Baltimore is a different situation. St. Louis is a different situation. And the question is, how do we get to making sure that everybody has a chance when they see the reflection of the city to and of itself, which is our skyline, that everybody thinks that that's the opportunities that exist, that represents, metaphorically, symbolically, is for everybody, not somebody, not some people.
So we don't have very many neighborhood schools, like neighborhood high schools anymore. And I think we just don't. People,
75% of our kids in high school go outside their neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. And so what does that mean long term? We don't actually know. Like, we're involved in an experiment with community, and we don't know what's going on. What happens when you take out the neighborhood school? What does that neighborhood continue?
It's interesting. So I was at Amazon today, and we had 15 engineering companies that are going to partner with our neighborhood schools and bring STEM education. Amazon's a neighborhood.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, so it has an IB, it has an international baccalaureate, it has a STEM, it has a partnership with Northeastern, and their graduation rate 5 years ago was 40-something. Today it's close to 94%, with a college attendance that's excelling. And that's a neighborhood school we're investing in, but it attracts students from all over the city, but it's a neighborhood school. And so I would challenge you on some of the categories used to describe.
So there was a story on BEZ today about Hope High School, and that it was doing really well. I don't know if you saw this, stop me if you did. No. It was doing really well, and then school choice came. I
was preparing for this interview with
you. School choice came, and something like a dozen alternatives opened around it. So what happens? It cannibalized the student body. Englewood High School closed, and so they took some of those students. And now this school has fewer than 100 students, and it's slated to close. And so even this idea of choice, those other schools, are they long for the neighborhood? That these, we don't know.
So here's the thing. Look, here's what I think is, there's a lot of stuff going on, and like we started, no one description describes it all. because there's different elements in there. And you would agree that there were some bad things happening at Cabrini-Green, but we started the interview. There's 3 people we know of who all came out of Cabrini-Green and are now major figures in the public.
Any of these schools, the same thing. Right. I mean, I said before that I embarked on a project which you would like a lot, which is that I just went to 20 different high schools here, and I found their valedictorian, and from a range of schools. Now, I didn't go to Lane Tech or Whitney Young.
So let me ask you a question, which is, as you think of Chicago, I asked you about housing because your book's about housing, and it's about much more. You're in the.
You didn't do the thing where you looked up your name to look what pages you're on?
I didn't say I didn't do that.
Okay.
I didn't say. I first looked at what you said about Ari. I didn't say that. No, I don't. Look, I mean, I lived this decision as vice chair of housing. Here's what I think. Public housing under Roosevelt had a great concept, mission, and purpose. Somewhere it lost its way. I don't think the mistake to tear down what became, in many ways, even though there were individual successes, collectively, almost, it was these, as you said, these were almost entire cities, and they were concentrations on race and poverty, which is not how it started.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking is, okay, we're far enough along on the plan for transformation of building the 25,000 units for families. But how do you not repeat a mistake but learn from it? In the end of the day, that's all I know about life, let alone politics, is if you made a mistake, what did you do wrong? What would you, because we're not going back and building this. We're not going back and building Cabrini-Green. We're in the middle. What do you make sure that the plan for transformation does? I happen to think what we're doing on public libraries inside public housing, public libraries inside schools, building grocery stores where there used to be food deserts, are trying to do things different so you not only don't repeat the mistakes, but you learn from the mistakes to actually get it right finally and build community. So
I agree that placing these around the city is only good, and the more of them, the better. Mm-hmm. And I think the more that there are wraparound services that are connected with it, the better. And meaning, and if that funding doesn't come from the federal government, then we have to figure out a way as a city and a state to do it, even though, the dire straits that we're in. I mean, that's important. I think New York is in that same situation where they have like $17 billion in unmet repairs suddenly in their public housing, and there are 400,000 people who live in public housing there. But it's not coming from Washington. The city has to step up. This is vital infrastructure. I do think like our fixation on the plan for transformation sort of, distracts us from the real problem. I mean, this is like such a, anyone here who was involved in it, they're so reactive to that. The 25,000 is like an arbitrary number taken in 1999 from a depleted population, which was already too small to meet demand. So like, and we can't put we can't put all the onus on public housing to meet this, to answer poverty. But we also think like, so how do we ramp up in some way to do that? And if it's not public housing, if it turns out that it's vouchers, and we have to manage this much larger system and do it better, and not, we did recreate some of the problems with vouchers. People went to poor and racially isolated neighborhoods mostly. And so how do we?
The vouchers, somewhat you could argue, almost replicated a problem that's invisible rather than visible.
And now it's less. And now it's invisible. Right. And if those families are forced out because there's a crummy landlord, nobody really knows.
So my thing is, you're mayor, and the real, I would say 60 years ago, mayors went to Washington and said, people are leaving, businesses are leaving, and we need help. Today, 60 years later, mayors are going to Washington and say, we're going to save you. We don't want you to save us. But our problem is, on a host of issues that you're talking about, Washington has walked away, and they are the only ones that have really the bandwidth from a resource standpoint. Now, I think, take what we've done here in public transportation. Because of our partnership with Washington, we found, I'm not saying it's all done, but our deficit, when I walked in, the deficit was around $9 billion. These are the numbers that move around all the time. We have an $8.4 billion capital plan.
For the public transportation.
Yeah, transportation. That was in, red line, purple line, the red line south, red, purple, blue line. These are all with the federal government. We're about to finish 95th Street train station. But you need that, and you're saying you have to step up. And I will tell you that if I got this room filled with mayors, they would all look at you and say, Ben, given a city and given all its challenges that it has to meet, the idea that a city today is going to totally let the federal government and the state government off the hook.
Well, not off the hook, but once they've let us off the hook, meaning they're not delivering, and we know.
Well, I would like to keep all my resources that I send there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, so I just mean that what else?
One place the federal government helped cities recently on homeless was veterans. Chicago's almost 90% of the way towards eliminating homelessness for veterans.
Right.
It is very hard to single-handedly, without any partnership, solve these problems. Now, I'm not saying, but doesn't mean you don't get caught trying.
Yeah. And I also, when I think about you and your job, there's both like...
Do you pray?
I don't pray. And I don't even always curse. I think that...
Can I hold you that?
There's both sort of the delivery of hard, whatever, real things that are going to change communities. But there's also the soft side, of inspiring people and giving them hope. And because the actual change is slow in coming. We all know that. Like, you can't say, I'm going to, connect these neighborhoods through this train and suddenly everyone, there's a reason this community was going to thrive and grow. That's going to take years to happen. And so that other side of we have such an image problem in Chicago, that in terms of the violence in particular. Even in terms of housing, you go to any neighboring city, small city in Illinois or even in the Midwest, and they think that the poor black people who came are all from Chicago public housing, which is an absurdity. Like, the towers were torn down over a decade ago, but that people who are still coming, that's why they have violence problems, because Chicago still represents this thing. And so how do we, who cares? The outside means something, but it's more inside that we know that people are also internalizing this, and they're feeling a little bereft, and they're feeling scared, and not necessarily on the near north side on Fulton Market, like, people are having a great time and spending millions of dollars there every night, but in other neighborhoods they're like, I think I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go to Atlanta
There's a change in the city, and making sure that people, look, my view as mayor is you got to make sure people, every part of the city feels safe. And there's a transformation right now under our nose in Englewood. But nobody walks around and says, you know what, I feel really 48% better than I did last year. But when you have 500 kids line up in their Halloween outfit outside the police station that everybody else reporting on thinks is got a problem, it means that there's a point that we've crossed and there's something else happening. We're not done yet making that happen. And we have a lot of work to do. But we also have a lot of strengths. And, my thing about us is we have to remember what our strengths are and then look at our challenges and make them opportunities for making us even stronger.
One of the things that, I've interviewed you now 3 or 4 times, and this isn't an interview, we're just having a conversation, or you're interviewing me, but your love for the city is real and deep. And it's also a troubled city, and so
there's no city that's not troubled today.
We're especially troubled in some respects, and so to love something that in some ways is feeling broken in some parts, and also knowing that there's beauty in there, but that's what I wrestle with in this book. You started by talking about these beautiful people that are in here, like that. Those two things coexist. It's not polar.
What I thought about those 4 people is they never gave up, and that's the Chicago character. So I have confidence that, look, I get back to the schools, and I just happen to come from an award ceremony and something else this morning. November 2017 was 30 years where William Bennett called it the worst in America. We now lead the country from an urban side. And there's a lot of success in front of us, and there's a takeaway from that if you stay at it, work hard enough, you can get it right.
Yeah.
So, are you going around the country?
I'm starting in the Midwest, locally, and then going to D.C. You know anybody there?
I know one place that the guy won't read it, so don't. I wouldn't visit there. Don't try for a book signing. All right, 5 takeaways. Ready?
Yeah.
Lake or river? You have to pick lake or river.
Oh, lake. Come on. I've actually only been on the river once in my whole life.
I'll take you for a little walk this summer.
Yeah.
Thick or thin pizza?
I started thick, of move to thin later in life.
It's about
It's
your
also- yeah, it's also
metabolism.
just- yeah.
It's your metabolism, brother. You just gave it away. Do you Hancock or Sears? I don't care what anybody else calls it today. Hancock or Willis Tower?
Sears Tower, for sure. Yeah, again.
Why?
Again, being a South Sider,
Okay.
it's a thing you see in the distance rather than the Hancock.
Okay, Cubs or Sox?
Come on, man.
No, you
I've
gotta
already
go.
answered that. White Sox.
Okay.
Talk
about hope.
And it's White Sox Park.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And then 12-inch or 16-inch?
16-inch. Yeah,
Okay, you passed all your Chicago
You
calls.
need to put that in every gym class in every school.
Yeah, is that what you would like?
Yeah, that needs to be instituted again.
Well, I'll make sure that Springfield then starts paying their fair share.
Yeah, good.
All right. Ben Austen, High Risers. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
You're listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Rahm Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using #ShyStories. Thanks for listening.